Hi, I'm Allison, and this is Learning Literature. If you have any requests for books you'd like me to discuss, just write them in the comments. Today I'll be talking about the 1882 play An Enemy of the People by Henrik Ibsen, who is probably most famous for his play A Doll's House. In 1950, motivated by McCarthyism and a climate of censorship, playwright Arthur Miller translated and adapted An Enemy of the People. Focused on this political environment, in the preface to his adaptation, Miller says the theme of the play is whether the democratic guarantees protecting political minorities ought to be set aside in time of crisis. More famously, Miller continued his response to this theme, pressure to be silent from authorities and the masses, with his 1953 play The Crucible. Miller clearly believed this to be a pressing issue. I have videos analyzing The Crucible as well. I'll link to them in the comments. It is Miller's version of An Enemy of the People that I will be focusing on. In the first act, we are introduced to Dr. Stockman. He has returned to his hometown after suffering with a difficult, low-paying job in a remote village. He is enthusiastic to be home, reveling in the sense of community and the luxuries that a more civilized environment offers. We see him enjoying life, symbolized by the small party he has gathered, where he notes his new tablecloth and sips a hot toddy, thrilled to be able to live like a prince. This joyfulness is sharply contrasted by his brother, Peter, the mayor of the town. Peter rejects the rich foods offered and criticizes his brother's socializing and frivolous attitude towards money. I stick to my tea and toast, much healthier and more economical. These initial differences set up a contrast that forms the foundation for the conflict of the play. The conflict is between the two men, between the ideas that they symbolize, and the values they pursue. Other characters emphasize this conflict in their own choices and interactions. Dr. Stockman's daughter, Petra, and their friend Horster live like Dr. Stockman, while the various newspaper men ultimately live like Peter. We learn that Dr. Stockman has been doing private research into the town's water. The recently opened baths have been a boon to the town's tourism, and everyone is profiting. Dr. Stockman determines, however, that the water is actually dangerous. Against his recommendation, the baths were built too low, and now they are being polluted by industrial waste. He is thrilled at the revelation, relieved to have discovered it early enough to stop the town's water from doing more harm. As a viewer, we may find this response naive. Thinking of the financial harm to the town, we can recognize that not everyone will be equally thrilled at this conclusion. This reveals Dr. Stockman's idealized commitment to truth. Not only is he happy to have discovered a truth that will ultimately keep people safer, he is certain that others will be equally happy at such a discovery. The small party at Dr. Stockman's house includes Hofstad and Billing, writers from the revolutionary newspaper where they defend the people. Dr. Stockman's research excites them as they see it as an opportunity to overthrow the current authority, a dump that is poisoning and polluting our whole social life. Everyone other than Dr. Stockman seems to understand the various consequences this news will have on the town leadership and finances. It is no surprise, then, when Dr. Stockman's brother returns to discuss Dr. Stockman's new conclusion and is less than thrilled with the news. Instead, Peter is focused on the immense cost required to make the changes, as well as the bad publicity at having built the baths in the wrong location, against Dr. Stockman's recommendation. Peter seems concerned with the profits of the business which owns the baths, which he is the president of, and the financial security of the town, as the tourism industry now supports most of the town and will need to shut down for years. Earlier, Peter accused Dr. Stockman of being too independent and not sufficiently concerned with society. You have an ingrained tendency to go your own way, Thomas, and that simply can't go on in a well-organized society. the individual really must subordinate himself to the overall, or, groping for words, he points to himself, to the authorities who are in charge of the general welfare. Peter sees this lack of consideration for society as problematic, and it is rising again on this issue. This clearly lays out key values on which Dr. Stockman and his brother differ. Is it right to prioritize one's own ideas and independence, or subordinate oneself to society and its leadership? Peter pushes Dr. Stockman to change his conclusion, insisting that the evidence does not lead to Dr. Stockman's conclusion that the water is dangerous. Or perhaps Peter is simply admitting that he does not like this conclusion, so he is refusing to come to it. Your report has not convinced me that the conditions are as dangerous as you try to make them. Dr. Stockman, however, retains his commitment to truth, insisting that his conclusion is based on evidence and will not change unless the evidence does. My convictions come from the condition of the water. My convictions will change when the water changes, and for no other reason. Despite threats from his powerful brother, Act 1 closes with Dr. Stockman's commitment to sharing this information with the town to help them fix the water and renew the tourism industry safely. Thus, we see a reiteration of Dr. Stockman's valuing of truth, now in contrast to his brother's willingness to avoid truths if they have undesirable consequences. Act 2 begins with the men of the revolutionary newspaper putting their full support behind Dr. Stockman. He views this as a key support in his fight against his brother. I have the liberal press with me and the majority. If that isn't power, what is? Such support is tempered by the publisher of the newspaper, Aslaksen, whose constant refrain throughout the play is in support of moderation. Thus far, Hofstede and Billing have rejected moderation as a value. They have advocated extreme support for the people and extreme change in the social structure. Immediately after supporting Dr. Stockman, though, Hofstede accuses Petra, Dr. Stockman's daughter, of being an extremist. He argues against integrity if violating one's principles will garner social support. A newspaper can't buck the public. This is the first weakening we see in Hofstede's commitments. Such weakening is continued when Peter visits the newspaper men and changes their minds about supporting Dr. Stockman. Peter tells the men that the money to fix the water supply will have to come from the townspeople as taxes, while emphasizing the long time frame during which the baths will have to be closed down. The newspaper men realize that the people will not support fixing the water supply, and suddenly they themselves do not support it. Has Peter manipulated them, or simply shared new information that persuaded them? It isn't obvious from the text, but it is clear that Hofstede and the others do not share Dr. Stockman's convictions for scientific truth. Instead, they change their minds about the baths when considering the unpopularity of Dr. Stockman's conclusion. Such a transition reveals a weakness in the solid majority that the newspaper men represent. Initially, Dr. Stockman saw their support as a key strength in his view. Now we see how easily their loyalties change, and thus we, along with Dr. Stockman, can reevaluate the real value of their support. This new perspective culminates in the town meeting, where Dr. Stockman intends to present his conclusions to the town. Peter attempted to shut down his ability to speak, but Dr. Stockman's friend Horster has offered his house, explaining simply, I've been in a lot of places where people aren't allowed to say unpopular things. Well, I don't like it. Before the meeting begins, Peter threatens Petra with arrest for painting a poster in support of her father. Proud of the principles she is defending, she immediately admits that she did the painting and offers her hands for arrest, demonstrating a willingness to accept the consequences for acting on her beliefs. It is just such a willingness that, earlier at the newspaper, Hofstede acknowledged to Petra that he does not have. Her integrity seems to scare Peter, who backs off his threats of arrest. When speaking at this meeting, Peter clearly manipulates the audience. In fact, the manipulation is so blatant, it seems as though the author is implicating the stupidity of the town for going along with it. Peter mischaracterizes his brother's position as being a ploy to undermine the authority in the town purely for the satisfaction of destroying authority. Peter never engages with the evidence his brother provides about the water. In fact, Peter riles the crowd up so much that they refuse to listen to any evidence Dr. Stockman attempts to provide. The people look ridiculous in this scene, being immediately persuaded to an entirely unsupported conclusion, and then refusing to hear any evidence to the contrary. It dramatizes a claim about most people's lack of independent thought, and thus the unimportance of caring about what the majority thinks on an issue. As a slight side point, it's worth noticing the various tactics Peter uses to persuade the crowd. He convinces them to dismiss Dr. Stockman's conclusion with a variety of techniques. He lodges personal attacks, claiming Dr. Stockman is a traitor to society. Peter raises vague doubts about the validity of his brother's scientific conclusions, insisting that Dr. Stockman is picking at minor flaws in the springs. He cultivates fear into the townspeople, reminding them that without the springs, their town was a dead third-rate hamlet, drawing connections to ruins of towns all over the world. He offers empty promises to the townspeople, distracting them with temptations of fine carriages, great homes, and first-class stores. Peter never addresses the actual facts or conclusion drawn from such evidence. So now the crowd is loudly against Dr. Stockman. Importantly, they have followed Peter's recommendation and refused to even let Dr. Stockman speak. There's an important lesson here about the value of sharing ideas and censorship by authority. The crowd is following authority, not hearing all ideas, and their conclusions are naturally weakened by their limited perspective. Now, Dr. Stockman doesn't want to talk to the crowd about the dangers of their water, which is good since they refuse to let him do so. Instead, he wants to share the new revelations he has had about being human. He has realized that being a man or part of the people is an honor to be earned by living as humans do, by their reason. He now sees that the majority, however, believes that ideas are right simply because they are the same as ideas held by everyone else. Such people are not using reason to critically evaluate ideas. Such men are not really men. Once the majority falls for Peter's methods in disparaging Dr. Stockman, the doctor understands that the majority is easily led and is not interested in analyzing evidence to evaluate claims. This is a key revelation for Dr. Stockman about the value of using your reason to draw conclusions, the need to do this individually, and the rarity with which it is done. The third act continues to pressure Dr. Stockman to retract his conclusions. He is threatened, tempted, insulted by his brother, the newspapermen, his father-in-law. They all offer whatever leverage they can to attempt to have him change his mind. Meanwhile, Dr. Stockman is facing pressure as a social outcast. Those around him don't dare to interact with him. With many apologies, his landlord is evicting him, his daughter and Horster have been fired, portraying weakness and fear in the majority. Dr. Stockman, however, has no such weakness or fear. He rejects all attempts by those around him to change his mind. Instead, he decides to open a school for his sons and other fresh children. He will teach them how to be open-minded and critical when facing new ideas, to share his commitment for reality and truth. He will turn out not taxpayers and newspaper subscribers, but free and independent people hungry for the truth. Is this a happy ending? Another way to ask this question is Dr. Stockman better off at the end of the play? An interesting subtext in the play is the complexity of answering this question. the challenge of determining who has acted selfishly and succeeded. Again, contrasting the brothers offers a helpful perspective to answer this. By the end of the play, Peter has stayed in power and kept all of his money. Dr. Stockman has lost his standing in the town and his job. It seems that Peter has acted selfishly, while Dr. Stockman has not acted in his own best interest. Yet it is not as simple as this. There are other considerations in determining what is in one's best interest. Peter is not truly acting selfishly throughout the play. Though these superficial conditions seem to benefit him, power, money, he has been pushed to acknowledge that he values these more than he values human life. Moving forward, as the baths make people sick, he will know that his choices led to their illnesses. As the town is destroyed because of the bad publicity from the baths, he will know that his choices led to the destruction of the town. Throughout that process, he will be faced with lying about whether or not he knew how dangerous the water was, pushing him to either repeat his poor decisions or face the consequences of his initial poor choice. Even if such accusations never come, he denigrated his own rational capacity by refusing to accept the evidence provided by his brother, reducing the credibility to himself of his rational conclusions. As Miller says in the preface to his adaptation, this play demonstrates that those who attempt to warp the truth for ulterior purposes must inevitably become warped and corrupted themselves. By contrast, throughout the play, Dr. Stockman is clear that he is fighting for his own benefit. Though he initially wants to be a part of the town, he is honest with himself about what kind of men they are, and that he does not value their companionship as they are. He fights because he refuses to be the miserable animal who'd crawl up the boots of that damn gang. He values the health of the bath's visitors, his own ability to draw rational conclusions, and the truth more highly than he values financial stability or a place within the town. He is fighting for what he values most, which means pursuing his own best interest. By following the hero, Dr. Stockman, and seeing a steady contrast with his brother, an enemy of the people argues that standing by your beliefs, even against the majority, is necessary to individual fulfillment and progress. Thanks for joining me on Learning Literature. If you have any follow-up questions, put them in the comments, and click like if you found the video helpful.